Welcome to a fresh take on the news, putting you at the centre of the national conversation about the issues that matter to you most. Tonight, war continues to rage in Europe as Russia bombards Ukraine. More than 1 million people have fled the country, civilians are under fire, and there are international calls for China to intervene. I'm Trevor Phillips, and this is The Great Debate. Each week, we go to the heart of the issue dominating the headlines. Tonight, as we continue the conversation about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, our viewers panel from across the country and across the world will have their say, they'll tell their stories, and they'll hold our studio panel to account. Joining us this week, Bill Browder, businessman, head of the global Magnitsky Justice Campaign, co-founder of the Institute for Strategic Dialogue and expert in disinformation, Sasha Havlicek. The former Foreign Office Minister, Alistair Burt. Sophia Gaston, Director of the British Foreign Policy Group. And joining us from Westminster for the first part of the show, before he returns to commitments in the Commons, the Conservative MP and military veteran, Bob Seely. All here to answer the question, can the West stop Vladimir Putin?
There is fresh condemnation tonight after Vladimir Putin's forces shelled a nuclear power station.
The worrying signs from President Putin is, in his words, he seems to indicate no limit.
We have sanctioned Russian oligarchs and Russian organisations.
These sanctions that you can see are equivalent of war.
He has underestimated the Ukrainians, he's underestimated their leader, and he has underestimated the unity of the West.
Immediate introduction of no-fly zone over Ukraine is needed because only this measure can guarantee that Russia will not hit nuclear infrastructure with rockets and air bombs.
In order to bring a no-fly zone in, it would need to be enforced, and that would almost inevitably mean that we would be engaged directly with Russian aircraft.
We're starting, as always, with our viewers' panel. Let's go to the wall and talk to Elaine Hamilton in Sunderland. Elaine, speak to us.
How long do you think the sanctions will take to have any serious effect on Putin's war?
Thank you, Elaine. Very direct question there, which I'll first start with you, Bob Seely. Elaine's question is, how long will sanctions take to have any serious effect on Vladimir Putin's war? Bob Seely, what do you think?
Good evening to your viewers. I think Elaine's question is a very good one, and the simple answer is we don't know. Vladimir Putin has prepared for this war for some time because he's built up a war chest of over $600 billion, quite a lot now of which he can't access, so that's potentially important. He has made a great claim in the past of Russia being a sovereign nation, and what he means by that is Russia being very self-sufficient. He claims that Russia is one of the few truly sovereign nations on earth, and I think that now is going to be tested. I think these sanctions will begin to have an effect very quickly. Whether it will have enough of effect to dissuade him of this course of action is another matter entirely, and that might be a much, much longer process.
If you had to bet, Bob Seely, do you think that the sanctions, as effective as they may be in the medium and long term, will deter him from his war aim of controlling or subjugating, I should say, Ukraine?
OK, Trevor, really good again. I think it is more likely than not. I'm going to put a negative view because Putin, thinks that the Russians can endure more than most people, i.e. he will make them endure more. That's the first point. And secondly, he is willing to pay an extraordinarily high price for getting Ukraine back, up to threatening nuclear war. And we don't know if he would ever go through with those threats. But this, for him, is what people call an existential issue. So it's a matter of life and death. And I think the Russian security elite, and you're talking about a very small number of people whose opinions may well not be shared by the massive population in Russia. That's a very important thing to say. That security elite has got itself into a position over the last few years of near hysteria.
Let's pick up that point about the soul of Russia. I want to bring in Anton from our viewers panel. Anton is one of a number of Russians living in the UK that we'll be hearing from over the course of the next hour. And I just want to make clear that, understandably, they've asked us not to use their surnames. Anton, what do you make of this? What is your view about what he'll do?
Well, first of all, obviously, it's terrific what's happening, and it's absolutely unexpected. I think 10 days ago, many of Russians would stand and say, we don't expect that actually go that far, but it actually did. So it's, I have to say, it's a surprise to a lot of people. In terms of sanctions specifically, so I do agree that it will take some time before the course of action may actually change, because that will directly depend on how the ordinary people feel the results of those sanctions, and if that's going to cause any internal disagreement, put it that way, or even maybe more protest or any of that action. I think today some of ordinary people have already experienced issues because of sanctions. I've spoken to friends in Russia, and yeah, there is impact over there. Will that be enough to cause a lot of stir? I'm not sure. It's hard to say today.
All right. Anton, stay there for a moment. Sophia Gaston, sanctions. Do you think they're going to be able to do enough fast enough?
I mean, it's quite clear that President Putin's not being motivated by economic stability, and he's quite clear to sell his own people down the river to pursue this really astonishing act of evil. Of course, the question is really, whether or not these economic sanctions can actually move from a period of, he will be very actively trying to harness the sanctions as a tool of cohesion in Russia. The question is, does it eventually get to a point where it actually turns the Russian people against him and his regime?
Bill Browder, you've worked for a long time with people who oppose Putin, and you're famously one of those people. Do you think that the sanctions can work fast enough to change his behaviour to save people in Ukraine?
Well, it all depends how you define sanctions. So we're not, sanctions is a broad term. We've started to sanction Russia. We've frozen the central bank reserves of Russia. We have disconnected a number of banks from SWIFT. We've sanctioned some oligarchs, but there's still a lot more sanctioning that needs to be done to say we have a complete sanctions program. So, for example, we've disconnected 70% of the banks from SWIFT, but there's another
SWIFT
30...
being the,
SWIFT is the
international banking messaging system.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So basically, if you disconnect 100% of the banks from SWIFT, then it pretty much knocks Russia back to the dark ages economically. We've sanctioned a dozen oligarchs. We probably need to sanction 100 oligarchs. And in my mind, this is not about changing Putin's mind. He doesn't have a reverse gear. He doesn't go in reverse. All he does is go forward. All he does is escalate. There's no negotiation. And so in my mind, the purpose of sanctions is to basically deplete him of the money to execute this war. And the war is very expensive. It's costing them billions of dollars a day, maybe more than that. And if he has no access to his internal capital, and if he has no access to his foreign capital through the oligarchs, then at some point, as he's going forward, he's going to stall out from lack of money. And that's the whole hope of this thing.
But the issue is time, isn't it? Let's just go back to our war for the moment. I want to talk to Sarmad Sabir.
I think Ukraine will eventually fall because NATO will not support. I think they should, but they won't. The other problem is when the Cold War was finishing, they agreed, USA and NATO, they agreed with Russia not to expand NATO. That was the biggest mistake they had made. And after that, they agreed with Ukraine to include them in NATO. That was another mistake which they made. And then the third mistake which they made, they provided safe havens to the Russian oligarchs. So when all of these things, they add together, that is the mistake which West and USA, they made, and that provided, and that enabled Russia to attack.
OK, thank you, Samba. Bob Seeley, Samran Sabir says he's not optimistic. He thinks Ukraine's going to fall.
I mean, I'm not optimistic because it's a pretty depressing situation and clearly deterrence has failed. I half agree with someone. Look, there were no promises made over NATO. There may be some verbal hints and nobody can, you know, I wasn't in the negotiations, but Gorbachev himself said there was no significant promises over NATO because nobody was thinking about NATO at the time. So Gorbachev has confirmed that there weren't any promises broken over NATO. What I do think that Simon's right on is that actually we should have been wiser about not offering NATO membership to Georgia and Ukraine, because then that gave Putin the excuse to move. He might well have done so anyway. By splitting Serbia and recognizing the independence of Kosovo, they have also the Russians have also repeatedly referred to that. So again, we've given them excuses for what they may have done anyway. But rather than flirt with the idea of NATO membership, what we should have said to Ukraine is, you're not going to be a member of NATO for 20 years, but what we will do is make you very difficult to invade. We should have made Ukraine too bitter a pill, rather than sort of flirting with the idea of NATO, enraging Putin, enraging the Kremlin, and giving him an excuse. He might well have moved anyway.
Sasha Havlicek, our fault.
Well, this is the thing. I think we have made a number of mistakes, but I don't think those are the mistakes. Putin has repeatedly tested Western resolve to see how far he could go the next time round. From the invasion of Georgia to Crimea, of course. This war in Ukraine isn't actually new. To the war in Syria, where he perpetrated war crimes that went entirely unanswered by the international community. Those red lines that have been crossed and crossed again. We had opportunities to push back, to start with sanctions earlier on that would have degraded his capabilities to get further and further and further. We had opportunities to start to really have an impact on his propaganda machinery, domestically, globally. We haven't done that until now. We've only just started to have measures taken in that regard. So we've made a lot of mistakes, and it isn't so unbelievable that Putin would assume that there would be very little pushback from NATO, from the EU, from the transatlantic alliance, because there hasn't been to date. So what I would say is we need to have the resolve now. And I do think that we're seeing some really quite seismic changes in response. We've seen the EU come to the table, offer weaponry in record time. We've seen a complete 180-degree turnaround in German foreign policy. They're investing in their military.
Yeah, the Germans are going to put 100 billion, I think.
Huge, 100 billion, and this is a massive departure in terms of their own foreign policy since the end of the war, the Second World War. We are starting. We see the EU now offer Ukraine membership of the EU, start to use enlargement as an actual tool of influence again in the neighbourhood. So there are some seeds for hope if we can sustain it. Now, that's the other question.
Well, we'll come to that. Alistair Burt, this was never your own specific territory, but you were in the Foreign Office for quite a long time.
Yeah.
We may be doing the right thing now, but 5 years too late.
I think there's a lot of analysis that can be done about what happened in the past, but there are some absolutes here. Whatever our review of policy might be, we've reached a situation where what is being done is unconscionable and without excuse, and we have to be very clear about that. I mean, looking back on what was done, I think there were moments when we might have been clearer. I was involved in the discussion in Syria in 2013 when Obama's red line was crossed with the use of chemical weapons in Syria. And I remember arguing with colleagues in the House of Commons about the impact of the United Kingdom not being prepared to challenge that by suggesting that there might be military action to follow. And I remember talking directly to MPs and saying, if you think a situation in which a combination of Assad, Iran and Russia is successful, if you think that's in British interests, I think you're wrong. And then Parliament voted against giving the government even the option.
You didn't win.
We didn't win. And I think you can look back on a number of things, but that would be... We've got to be very careful that that does not excuse what is happening. There's an old saying, and Bob is a soldier, and I never was, but you don't know what happens when the first bullet is fired. It is true that Russia must have prepared for this, Putin must have prepared for this, but some things have happened that he didn't expect. I think the extraordinary response of the Ukrainian people is one. The coming together of the EU and others is another. All that, and the protests. So I think this is different in character from what he expected.
We'll come on, actually, to what happens next, as it were, and how we think about it strategically. But I want to just stick with where we are tonight and come back to our war. Regular viewers will remember that last week we spoke to Marina Ivanyuk, and Marina talked about the experience of people that she knew in Ukraine, and also called for the no-fly zone. Now, Marina, what do you make of what's happened in the last week? How are you feeling tonight?
So every day, Ukrainian needs more and more help. So me and my friend, we are trying in the coming days, try to drive to Ukraine and deliver 500 donated sleeping bags and some humanitarian help as well. And on the way back, I'm planning to take my husband's parents to the United Kingdom. So the world acted late to prevent Russian invasion.
Marina, we know you're going to go tomorrow. Travel safely.
Thank you.
Bob Seeley, I know you have to get back to business in the Commons, but thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
We're going to go for a break now, but this is The Great Debate. Up next, who's telling the true story of what's really happening in Ukraine?
Russian state communications regulator says it has decided to completely block access to Facebook in the country.
Russia Today, RT's own editor-in-chief, called the network an information weapon.
In Russia, protesters again took to the streets across the country. Those who see through the propaganda and know this war is wrong.
It's unprecedented for the MOD to release intelligence via a post on social media, a sign of Britain using information to fight back.
I'm Inzamam Rashid and I'm Sky's North of England correspondent. We give a voice to communities often unheard and unserved from a region with a distinct history and global impact.
ba ma dalee commencé liggéey bi yokkute bu bari am nañ ko ci.
Welcome back to the great debate. Can the West stop Vladimir Putin? The images played around the world of the Ukraine invasion often show horribly familiar scenes. Men conscripted to fight, tanks rolling in and gunfire and shelling hitting towns and cities. But this war is being fought on another front too. The information battle is raging online as both sides tell their own version of events. Clive Eshelman, you're in Accra. I think you're watching this and you've got a view about the information war. Clive.
Yes. Thank you very much. I like the point that Sasha raised about her dialogue. My question is, who is controlling the propaganda about the Russian invasion and what is the end game?
Thank you, Clive. So Clive's got a straightforward question for our panel. Who is controlling propaganda about the Russian invasion and what is the end game? Sasha, what do you think?
The Russians have seen information as a central pillar of their domestic and foreign policy for always, and they've invested really heavily in building out an infrastructure for information operations around the world that combines effective state media, which is essentially an extension of the Kremlin's foreign policy arsenal, so RT, Sputnik. It combines that with all sorts, a massive network of pro-Kremlin influencers around the world, and then all the covert tactics that we came to associate in 2016 with Brexit and the US presidential elections in the West, because this has been going on, of course, in Russia's sphere of influence for much, much, much longer. But the botnets, the cyborg nets, the troll farms, and of course, all the hacking that we've seen. And that power, you ask the end game. The end game is really to undermine the liberal world order and the liberal democracies that underpin it. It is to undermine the very concept of truth and a shared reality. And in the context of this war, it has laid the foundations for a domestic audience and for a Russian audience in Ukraine and elsewhere.
Domestic audience in Russia, you mean?
In Russia, for this conflict, providing reasons for this conflict, telling the people that this is about saving the people of Ukraine from a Nazi regime, saving Russians from attack within the country.
Let's go to Tanya. Tanya, you're in Hertfordshire. Speak to us about your experience and your family, I think.
Hello, yes. I've been living in the UK for 20 years, but my dad and my family is still in Russia, in Siberia. And yes, I am very sad about what's happening in Ukraine, and I'm trying to talk to my family, but unfortunately, back in Russia. But unfortunately, they do believe television, they do believe Putin's propaganda. And I actually had to pause my communication with lots of my friends and family because we just can't understand each other. They genuinely believe what they see on television. They genuinely believe that what Russia is doing in Ukraine is not the war, but it's a special operation to free Ukrainians. and especially believe that I am brainwashed, and everyone in the West is sort of watching the news and also brainwashed into thinking that that's not right.
So when you say to them, you see it in a different way, they just don't believe you?
Yes, we start arguing with each other, and yes, they try to persuade me, saying whatever I'm watching, that's not right, that I've been in the UK too long, and I don't really see the real picture, and they know the real picture, they know all the stories. They tell me all the stories about what happened in Donetsk and Donbass, and about they always say the same things, what you've been doing for 8 years since the war in Donbass and the Russian children being killed by Ukrainians and the West. So that's the main propaganda which they believe in.
All right. Stay there for a moment, Tanya. Let's talk to someone who is actually in Ukraine, Vitaly. I think you must have heard what Tanya has just been saying. What do you think?
Yeah, so I totally agree. This is a huge problem, how one can reach Russians who are in Russia and tell them, bring them some alternative information to what they receive from television, because television is Russia, is controlled by the Kremlin, and people have very few options to get information from elsewhere. So social networks are one of such options. And since the beginning of the war, Ukrainians, so Ukrainian media, civil society organizations, but also Western media have been using social networks like Facebook, Twitter, YouTube to break through to Russians and to explain them what's really going on, that it's not some kind of special military operation, that it's real war in which civilians die. But so, in my opinion, that has proven to be really effective since Russia has blocked Facebook, Twitter, it's talking about blocking YouTube, and there are even rumors about Russia breaking off from the internet completely and like establishing its own internal network, which has been tested since 2019. So in my opinion, the only way now to reach Russians on internet is via Telegram, a messenger which is fairly popular in Ukraine and in Russia, and maybe through Russian social networks, VK and Odnoklassniki, but these are less popular.
Thank you, Vitaly. Bill Browder, this is pretty grim, isn't it? I mean, if we're in a situation where Russian people literally can't see the world in the way the rest of us do, what are the chances of any change?
Well, it all depends on where change comes from. So we've talked about where the information war is being won by the Russians, but let me just talk for a second about where the information war has been won by the West. In past conflicts, Putin has created so many alternative narratives. So, for example, when Georgia was invaded, Putin said they fired on us first, and the West said no, Russia fired on Georgia first, and everyone was all confused. With this conflict, the United States and Great Britain and all the allies every day for 6 weeks said Russia's going to invade, Russia's going to invade, Russia's going to invade. And by the time Russia invaded, we all had an agreement in the West that Russia invaded, that there was no other example, there was no other explanation for this. And because of that, we were able to all lock arms and then create external consequences for the Russians. And if we hadn't done that, I think that this situation would be far worse. If there's any chance this is going to end, it's going to end because of the economic dislocation of Russia from the West.
All right. Well, there is more than one Russian view. We'll be hearing it in a moment. Coming up, we'll be joined by the Russian chess grandmaster and chairman of the Renewed Democracy Initiative, Garry Kasparov. Can the West stop Vladimir Putin? That's the topic for this week's great debate. Before we come back to our viewers' panel, we're joined from New York by the Russian chess grandmaster and human rights campaigner, Garry Kasparov. A lot of people in Europe are hoping that in some way, shape or form, Mr. Putin can be deterred. Do you think that is possible?
Yes, it is possible. I would say it's not just possible, it's absolutely necessary. Vladimir Putin is an existential threat, not only to Ukraine or to Europe, but to the world. And unless we defeat him in Ukraine, so the consequences could be beyond our ability to control. There is no doubt that Putin will continue testing NATO for its resolve to fight back. And he's in a desperate situation. The Russian economy is in terrible shape. And as every dictator, after 22 years in power, he needs foreign aggression to justify his stay on top of Russian power. And I think that's what is missing, is the political will to recognize the reality. There is no compromise with cancer. There's only one way. It's you need a surgery. And as long as Putin stays in Kremlin, there will be no peace.
Well, how do you get him out? There are only two ways, I guess, the Russian people themselves or a war.
Look, we don't need a war, a new war, because one war is already happening. And as we could see, Ukrainian army, despite the fact that they were not well equipped and the free world missed so many opportunities to arm Ukrainians to the teeth and to even to rise the cost of this criminal war for Putin, they're still inflicting huge damages to Vladimir Putin. But we need to combine things. So to overthrow a dictator, you need to add few components. One is the geopolitical military defeat. And with support of the free world, Ukrainian army can do it. Then blockade, financial, economic, and technological. Throw Putin's Russia in the technological stone age. Russian economy depends on Western tech support almost exclusively. And let's see what happens. So whether it's 1 week, whether it's 1 month, it will not take long before Russian people will start looking at their freezers. As we say in Russia, eventually freezer always beats TV. And I think it will end up with a massive revolt. But we need real sanctions. We need political will to finish Putin off. So far, unfortunately, the free world is always looking for some middle ground. So I don't feel that there's the resolve and political strengths in America or in Europe to fight this war as it has to be fought. It's not chess. You cannot have a tie. It's either we win or Putin wins.
So briefly, war, in your view, war with NATO is inevitable.
Look, it's not about Putin. Putin can tell anything he wants and he's crazy, but let's all deal with him. It's about people who will carry his orders. And the moment these generals recognize that they're dealing with NATO, I want to see what is their readiness to sacrifice their own lives. If the no-fly zone is imposed, I wanted to see how many kamikazes there are in the Russian Air Force that will continue their murderous campaign of killing Ukrainian civilians.
Garry Kasparov, thank you very much indeed. Let's go back to the wall and talk to Karl McKeever. A lot of support there from what Mr. Kasparov's been saying. But Garry, Karl, what do you make of it?
Hi, Trevor. Well, I'm a business consultant and I work internationally. I've previously worked in Moscow for both Harley-Davidson and IKEA, two brands which have recently said that they're going to pause their operations there. Now, for me, it was very evident that when I was there, people who'd been employed directly by these brands were much more liberal in their approach and values. They were certainly less suspicious and cynical and really much more open than many of the other people that I met. Now, these are the very people, modern Russians, which are being shut down, being cancelled and arrested by Putin's regime. So my question is, how can the West seize this moment to build trust with a new generation of Russians who will all need for peace?
Thank you, Karl. There's a question for our panel. How can the West rebuild trust with a new generation of Russians? Alistair Burt.
Where there is existing engagement with Russians, keep going. there may be academic researchers. Lancaster University is just one of the universities in the country that will have Russian students who will be there. To make a mistake that all Russians think the same is obviously wrong, but equally, as we have heard, the stories they are being told means that to be complacent that they think as we do is obviously equally wrong. But I think there has to be a combination. This isolation of the Kremlin and the decisions taken by Putin must continue. The people will reflect that, as Gary Kasparov was saying. The freezer will be affected. People will know that something's happened. Those who have stories coming back from Ukraine will know that the narrative that they were fed, that it was the liberation of Russians there, is untrue, as they are met not with roses on the tops of tanks, but bullets and guns and resistance. Gradually, word will get through. You've got to believe that there is an opportunity for that, and every step must be taken to isolate and confront in every possible way in order to prevent the catastrophic war that people fear might be inevitable. But I think engaging with those whom we know, and there are plenty of us that have contact with those in Russia, keep that going so they know that people outside are not, as Putin will tell them, Russophobes, but want to work with people in Russia, but be perhaps much more clear-eyed than we've been in the past about the desires of the state that Putin runs.
All right, let's get a sense of quite how that sentiment plays with people in Russia or people connected with Russia. Konstantin and Albina, I think you would have a view about this.
Yes, most certainly, yeah. I think it's extremely important to continue speaking to Russian people of all the generations. Yes, younger Russians like us, we're completely against the war. We woke up with a feeling of shame 10 days ago, with a feeling of anger against people who represent us in the government. And so it's crucial that we find a way to represent our country now and other Russian people who speak against the war here and in other countries around the world, to be the real embassy of Russian people.
Yes, and I just wanted to say that Russian people, they are against this war. It's just become extremely dangerous to speak up. And the people who come to the protests in Russia, they are very brave people.
Thank you. Let's talk to another Russian viewer who is in London. Liz, what is your view? Do you think that there is a generation or a section of the Russian population that can be persuaded to look at this differently to the Kremlin?
I agree that there is a lot of people who don't want this war, who don't sign under this decision. And it's incredibly hard to say how many, because it's very dangerous. It's up to 15 years in prison to say anything against the war. There were 5,000 people detained yesterday on protests. People are afraid to be drafted to the army and fight the war they don't want. But they, as Gary is saying, they see already that the freezer is impacted as well. So the prices go up, people are getting fired from their jobs. And I know that Putin is using sanctions as a way to reinforce the West as an enemy. So it's probably not really bringing more people on the streets now. It's just silencing more people, making them angrier for right now. So those who are trying to flee, they are fleeing to wherever they can. And it's not the West at the moment. It's Turkey, it's Georgia, because that's where the flights exist. But what's going to happen next is hard to say. We are all kind of rid of our identity at the moment.
OK. Liz, thank you so much. Sophia, how realistic is this hope that there can be a sea change in Russian sentiment that would dislodge Mr. Putin?
I mean, I think it's really difficult, as many of our speakers have made clear tonight. There are enormous inhibiting factors against Russians being able to speak out. Anyone who's involved in these protests, anyone who's accessing information, anyone who's trying to sort of push the needle on this is facing severe, grave personal danger for themselves and their families. So we shouldn't make light of that. I do think that in the West, we need to be absolutely clear that this is an issue with Putin and his regime in the Kremlin, and not with the Russian people nor the Russian culture. And I think we need to think about a longer-term plan here. The Foreign Secretary here has talked about creating a network of liberty. That needs to go beyond governments. That needs to be about people as well. And I think we need to think about immigration tools and pathway schemes. People who want to find safe passage into the West for a new life. We need to think about our higher education system, ways we can bring that talent over for people who are seeking a new life. And I mean, we've been doing this to great effect in Hong Kong with a very generous scheme to British nationals overseas there who are facing persecution with China's crackdown in Hong Kong. We need to think about pathways for Russia, because I think what is really concerning here is that Putin is essentially creating a much more isolated state, and that is dangerous for the Russian people, but it's also dangerous for us, because the more disconnected and dislocated we become from this regime, the less, the more opacity there is, the harder it is to understand what's going on. That's when you have sort of danger of miscommunication and things that can really escalate.
You mentioned China, and in fact, we want to come to that example and the influence of that country in a moment. You're watching the great debate. After the break, does China hold the diplomatic answer to the Ukraine invasion?
I'm David Blevins, and I'm Sky's senior Ireland correspondent.
It was everything that a journalist might want in a story.
A story that you'd be proud to have filmed.
But they didn't want journalists to see the real story.
It was very tiring, it was very sad, it was very scary at times.
Hey, there's no need for this.
But you have to keep going.
Oh, look at that.
You don't want to lecture people, but you do have to give them the facts.
They've pushed the protesters further back here. There's around 200 or 300 still remaining.
I'm Dan Whitehead, and I'm Sky News' West of England correspondent.
This van goes onto the streets of Plymouth 7 days a week, 365 days a year.
These facilities at the moment are a lifesaver. It's all we've got.
From fishing communities to bustling cities, we spend every day reporting from across the region, hearing from people who have real stories.
I'm going to have nowhere to live for about 3 or 4 months.
There are still people inside the properties here. They're coming from the epicentre of what is now a global health pandemic.
We were seeing and speaking to young women who were selling themselves right on the high street. It was desperately sad, and the fact it was happening right in the heart of this community. Before Brexit, these oysters were being exported to the EU, but the trade stopped overnight.
What's your feeling about the future then?
Blake, might all be finished, I don't know.
I love my job because I get to do something that is contributing to a better future.
This is the great debate. Can the West stop Vladimir Putin? And if not the West, how about China? Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison says no other country will have a bigger impact in bringing the war to an end. But so far, President Xi Jinping has held back from condemning Mr. Putin's actions. And over the weekend, China suspended coverage of Premier League matches in order to avoid broadcasting displays of solidarity with Ukraine. Let's talk to Michael Moe in Cambridge. Michael is an old friend of the programme. What do you think?
Hi, Trevor. I have a take on this question, I think, but I think it would be better to put it out first. So my question is, should the world expect China to be a key negotiator for peace in Ukraine?
Before I come to our panel, what do you think, Michael? You probably know the Chinese regime better than pretty much any of us.
I think it would be rather naive for the West to believe that China could be a negotiator out of goodwill. So Xi is busy with his third-term preparation. So unless he could get a good result or a positive impact contributing to his third-term success, I don't think that Xi or China as a whole would be helping out of the situation.
Michael, thank you. Sophia Gaston.
I think it's important to note that President Xi has a very different compact with his citizens in China than President Putin does. He has a compact that is based around economic growth and stability. For those reasons, I think the disruption to sort of global economic markets, all of the kind of insecurity that's been inspired by this invasion is not something that the President Xi and his regime were thrilled about. But certainly, I think, you know, as has just been made clear, there's no room for naivety here. I think he is always acting within his own interests, and it's not necessarily a sort of values-driven approach, which we in the West might sort of like to anticipate. I think we have to accept that there are some degrees of meaningful cooperation emerging between China and Russia. I think we have sleptwalked on a bunch of those, and we need to be incredibly attuned to them. There has just recently been a new kind of international relations pact between the two leaders. But that said, China does fundamentally recognize there are some areas of the international community and the world order that it continues to wish to play in when it suits their interests.
OK, Alistair Burt, you've probably spent quite a lot of time in rooms with people from both countries. Would China be a friend in this situation?
It's the wrong word. China has interests, and China has interests in a stable world for its economic advancement. It has made so much in the last 20, 30 years all over the world. Its Belt and Road programme, economic development, stability is essential for that. If that is disrupted, and people are now talking about the impact of food disruption, the wheat harvest being affected, people not getting enough food, anything that affects the stability that China is dependent on will cause them difficulty. I think they've been surprised at the reaction of the West as well, and that will give them another reason to try and find some way to minimise the damage that's being done. But I think the friendship is perhaps not the right word. Also remember, as we talk, in Vienna at the moment, Russia, China, the United Kingdom are all working together in relation to a new nuclear deal with Iran, and they are sitting down and having to work together with all this going on as well. And I make that point because where interests coincide and they're trying to get a new deal in very difficult circumstances, people can work together. But no one should be guided by any sense of friendship here. Dave McCormack, I think, Dave, you're in Doncaster. Dave, what do you think about this prospect of China being able to help to broker some kind of peace?
Yeah, to me, China is the only nation capable of stopping Putin on top of increased Western sanctions. I'll give you an analogy to the current war. Putin is the school bully terrorizing the smaller kid, Ukraine. The rest of the playground need to persuade a stronger nation to intervene to counteract him. This is not just NATO, but China. The West needs to persuade China that its GDP and economy is heavily reliant on Western trade. Nearly 14% of UK imports are from China. USA has 20% from China. Okay. China really needs to make a choice to either continue exporting to the West or deal with Russia, whom the rest of the world has alienated. If China sides with the West, the Russian economy would collapse.
All right. Dave, thank you very much. And you're getting a lot of support right there behind you. Bill Browder, China, the answer.
Well, let's look at the story. So Putin waited until the end of the Olympics in China before he invaded Ukraine. Why did he do that? Because he didn't want to make his friend Xi Jinping look bad and mess up his big spectacle. I don't think there's any chance in 1,000 years that China is going to intervene to do anything here. China sees this as an opportunity. As the West surrounds Russia and economically isolates Russia, China sees this as a great way for Russia to go to a lender of last resort and say to the Chinese, we need money, and the Chinese will be licking their lips and saying, yeah, you can borrow some money on a credit card terms. And why don't you throw in this pipeline and throw in this oil field and throw in this and that? This is like the biggest opportunity for China to take what they want from Russia.
OK. As they say on other shows, to be continued. I don't suppose this is the last time we're going to be talking about this. But that's all we have time for this evening. So it just remains for me to say thank you to our panellists here in the studio. Bill Browder, Sophia Gaston, Alistair Burt, Sasha Havlicek. Of course, it's you at home at the centre of this conversation. If you'd like to be part of the programme next time, get in touch by emailing thegreatdebate@sky.uk. And for now, thank you, as always, to The Wall, to our viewers panel. Very thoughtful contributions tonight, and especially thank you to those from a Russian and Ukrainian background. For you at home, keep talking. And we'll see you again at the same time next week for The Great Debate.